What happens when one of the NFL's most promising young pass rushers suddenly loses half a season before he even gets a chance to prove what he can do in year two? That is exactly where the Atlanta Falcons find themselves with James Pearce Jr. The league has now handed Pearce an 8-game suspension for violating the NFL's personal conduct policy. And the timing could hardly be worse for Atlanta. Pearce is coming off a rookie season in which he recorded 10.5 sacks in 17 games. And the Falcons were expecting him to become one of the centerpieces of their defense. Instead, he will miss the first 8 regular season games of 2026. The suspension begins August 30th, and Pearce is eligible for reinstatement November 2nd, potentially putting his return around Atlanta's Week 9 matchup with Cincinnati in Madrid. And this isn't simply a football story. The suspension comes from an incident in South Florida on February 7 involving Pearce and his former girlfriend, WNBA player Rickea Jackson. Pearce was arrested following the incident, and the NFL subsequently conducted its own investigation under the league's personal conduct policy. It is important to separate what has been established from what was initially alleged. The criminal case and the NFL's disciplinary process are different proceedings, and the NFL's 8-game suspension is the league's own punishment for its policy violation. Pearce chose not to appeal the suspension. That decision immediately changed the Falcons' entire offseason. Atlanta wasn't preparing to enter 2026 without Pearce. The team was preparing to unleash a player who had already shown serious pass rushing ability as a rookie. Now, instead of building the defense around his presence from week 1, Atlanta has to find a way to survive roughly half the regular season without one of its most dangerous edge threats. And the timing gets even more complicated because the Falcons have already lost another important piece of their pass rush, Jalon Walker, to a season-ending ACL injury. Suddenly, what looked like a promising defensive front has a very different shape. Pearce's rookie production explains why this matters so much. In his first NFL season, the former first-round pick produced 10.5 sacks in 17 games. That isn't the profile of a player Atlanta can casually replace with one name on the depth chart. He had already established himself as a major part of the team's pressure package, and the Falcons were expecting him to take another step forward. Instead, they now have to spread that responsibility across several players. Atlanta has options. Azeez Ojulari has experience creating pressure. Samson Ebukam brings veteran experience. Cameron Thomas can contribute on the edge. Jalon Trice is another player the coaching staff has been evaluating. And the Falcons recently added veteran Cameron Sample as they tried to strengthen the position group. But none of that changes the basic problem. Replacing a 10.5 sack player isn't about finding. The Falcons thought they were preparing for a breakout season. Instead, they are preparing for a defensive reality nobody in Atlanta wanted to face. James Pearce Jr. won't be there when the games start counting. And the biggest problem isn't simply replacing his sacks. It's replacing the pressure he created before the quarterback ever got a chance to throw. Because that's what made Pearce so valuable as a rookie. 10.5 sacks tell you what happened at the end of the play. They don't tell you how often offensive linemen had to account for him, how quickly quarterbacks had to make decisions, or how his presence could change an entire protection scheme. When that player disappears, the defense doesn't just lose a statistic. It loses a problem for the offense to solve. And now Atlanta has to find another problem. The Falcons already knew their defensive front needed work. Then Jalon Walker suffered a season-ending ACL injury, removing another important piece from the equation. Suddenly, the margin for error became much smaller. Atlanta can no longer afford to have one or two players carrying the pass rush. The production has to come from the entire group. That's where players like Azeez Ojulari, Samson Ebukam, Cameron Thomas, Jalon Trice, and Cameron Sample become so important. None of them has to become James Pearce Jr. That's probably the wrong way to look at it. Instead, Atlanta needs several players to collectively replace what Pearce brought to the field. One player might win with speed. Another might create pressure with power. Another might force the quarterback off his spot, even without getting the sack. Those plays won't always make the highlight reel. But over the course of 8 games, they could determine whether Atlanta's defense survives. And here's the part that makes the situation especially interesting. Pearce is still around the team during the preseason. He can practice. He can play, he can prepare, he can watch the defense develop. But there is a deadline coming. Once August 30th arrives, he begins serving the suspension. So Atlanta gets a strange preview of the player it's about to lose. Coaches can watch Pearce generate pressure and know that those snaps won't be available once the regular season begins. Teammates can work alongside him while preparing for the possibility that they'll spend the first half of the season without him. And the coaching staff has to use every preseason opportunity to figure out what the defense looks like when its young pass rusher isn't there. That makes every preseason rep more important than it might appear. Because by the time week 1 arrives, the Falcons can't suddenly say, now what? They have to know. They have to know who starts. They have to know who rotates. They have to know which pass rush combinations work. They have to know whether they can generate pressure with 4 defenders or whether they'll have to manufacture it with blitzes and quarterbacks around the league.